Ezra scraped the tooth from his cereal bowl with a scalpel, enamel gritted under the blade like crushed sun-bleached bone. The cereal was cold, the milk curdled into yellowish lumps. He'd eaten it without tasting, just as he'd eaten the last 3 bowls of this brand. The tooth was small, yellowed, but not human. It felt like a fossilized insect wing. The cat's pale hand-tongue licked it clean off the spoon. Not a lick. A slow, deliberate reach. Fingers like pale, dead skin, thumb and index curled, touching the tooth with the precision of a surgeon's tool. The cat sat on the counter, its fur the color of old banknotes, eyes reflecting the weak neon glow from the street below. Its tongue wasn't a tongue at all. It was a tiny, cold hand, pale as a corpse's knuckle, reaching out to take the tooth. Ezra's reflection in the chrome sink screamed silently, black eyes, mouth moving, no sound. He dropped the scalpel, wrong cutting sharp. Wrong. The sound wasn't in the air. It was in his skull, the sound of a scalpel sliding through paper. Not skin. Standing dry on linoleum, he felt the wet squelch of water in his ears. Not a memory, a physical sensation. Like standing on the deck of a sinking ship, the water already filling his eardrums. Underwater, while the neon green lightning flashed outside. No thunder, just the rhythmic breathing right behind his neck. Each inhale was a soft, wet rasp. A sound of something large and slow moving in the dark space between his shoulder blades. His scalp led where he'd ignored the cut earlier. A tiny gash from the scalpel's edge. Unnoticed during the cereal ritual, he felt the blood warm on his skin, a slow drip onto his collar. Copper taste bloomed on his tongue. Copper, not the metallic tang of blood. He turned his head, slowly, deliberately. The apartment was empty. Just the flickering neon sign from the street. Bio-recycling, casting green light through the grimy window. The air smelled of ozone and stale coffee. He pressed a finger to the cut on his scalp. The blood was thin, almost watery. He wiped it on his shirt. The fabric already stained with the faint yellowed streaks of old cereal. The cat was gone. The counter was empty. The tooth was gone. Only the ghost of its pale hand-tongue lingered in his mind. He walked to the window. The city below pulsed with the same sickly green light. Figures moved in the cybernetic slums, their faces obscured by glowing masks. A woman in a raincoat walked past, her shadow stretching unnaturally long across the wet pavement. The shadow didn't move with her. It stayed rooted to the ground, like it was anchored by something unseen. Ezra felt a sudden, sharp pressure in his chest. Like his lungs were filling with water, he coughed a dry, hacking sound. Water, water. He looked down at his hands. They were damp. Not from the sink, from the inside. The rhythmic breathing behind him deepened. It wasn't behind him anymore. It was inside him. He could feel it in his ribs, a slow, wet pulse matching the city's neon pulse outside. The reflection in the window, the one he'd seen screaming silently, it was still there. But now it wasn't screaming. It was smiling. A slow, wide smile stretching the black eyes into slits. The cat's pale hand-tongue flicked out from the reflection, not touching the window, but reaching through and through with. Ezra's own hand twitched. He felt the cold, pale touch on his wrist. 5 minutes, Sith. The cat's agenda, whatever happens to the cat, happens to him 5 minutes later. The reflection's smile widened. The breathing inside him became a gurgle. He tried to scream. His throat closed. No sound, just the wet, inside-out sensation of his own voice dissolving into the water filling his lungs. The neon green lightning flashed again, illuminating the apartment in a sudden, brutal green. The water in his ears surged. He could feel the pressure building in his chest, the slow, inevitable drag of the deep. The reflection's mouth moved, forming words without sound, a copper. The taste bloomed again, stronger this time, flooding his mouth, his throat. Tapa! He leaned against the window, the cold glass pressing into his forehead. The city lights blurred into streaks of green and gold. The reflection's black eyes held his. The breathing stopped. The water filled his lungs. Copper! Copper taste bloomed on his tongue. The brass key felt cold against my palm, heavier than it looked. Not the weight of the metal, but something else, a density, like compressed time. I pressed it to my tongue, a foolish impulse, and the taste erupted. Not the expected tang of aged brass, but a hot, thick sweetness, like pennies dissolving in rainwater. A coppery bloom coated my mouth, the flavor clinging to the back of my throat, a phantom ache. I dropped the key onto the damp linoleum, the sound swallowed by the submarine's constant, low thrum, a vibration that wasn't audible precisely, but felt in the fillings of my teeth. The machine hummed, a sustained note that resonated through the metal hull, a mechanical heartbeat in this sunken tomb. Decades, perhaps centuries, since the last maintenance. Bioluminescent organisms clung to the portholes, pulsing with a sickly internal light. They weren't pretty, more like tumors spreading across the glass, obscuring the black abyss outside. I checked my pulse, a pointless exercise. Too fast, then too slow, the rhythm stuttering like a broken metronome. My lungs felt full, not congested, not painful, just tightly occupied, as if I'd been holding my breath for an impossible length of time, even though the air was stale but breathable. The rhythmic breathing. It hadn't stopped. Still there, a soft rask against the back of my neck, a wet exhalation that sent a shiver across my skin. But it wasn't behind me anymore. It was internal. A pressure building in my chest, mimicking the submarine's low thrum, a damp pulse against my ribs. I ran a hand over my wrist, searching for a vein, needing to confirm I was still anchored to something real. A thin, crimson line appeared where my fingers pressed, but the blood felt wrong. Thin, almost watery, lacking the vital warmth I expected. I glanced at the keyhole. The cat's reflection wasn't there, not immediately. I blinked, adjusted my focus, and there it was, a distorted image, elongated and wavering like a heat mirage. The reflection twitched, a subtle jerk of the head, a fleeting expression that wasn't my own. Then it simply vanished, dissolved into the darkness within the keyhole. 5 minutes, the cat's agenda. Whatever fate befell that creature, whatever transformation it underwent, would be mirrored in my own flesh. 5 minutes hence. A ludicrous notion, of course. But the copper taste lingered, a metallic insistence on my tongue, and the internal breathing grew more pronounced. I watched the cat's shadow, stretched and distorted by the dim interior lights. It stood motionless, a dark silhouette against the curved metal wall. Then it splitty, not fractured, not broken. It elongated, duplicated, as if a seam had opened in reality, and a second shadow emerged. Identical, but a subtle distortion, a slight asymmetry. My own shadow followed suit. I hadn't moved, didn't even breathe. Yet the darkness beneath my feet began to unravel, to fray at the edges. A second phantom shadow peeled away, mirroring the cat's grotesque duplication. It reached for the keyhole, a dark, elongated hand extending towards the brass lock. My hand hadn't moved, but my shadows did. The metal of the key felt slick beneath my fingers. I tried to pull away to break the connection, but my limbs felt leaden. Unresponsive, the shadow's hand closed around the key, turning it with a silent click. The submarine groaned, a deep, resonant sigh that vibrated through the floor. A new section of the hull shifted, revealing a narrow passageway, shrouded in darkness. The rhythmic breathing inside me intensified, a gurgling rush of air. The water in my lungs swelled copper. The taste bloomed, overwhelming, coating my tongue, filling my throat. The shadow stepped through the opening, and I felt with a chilling certainty that I was about to follow. The corridor smelled of rust and something else, a sweetness, cloying and unsettling, like overripe fruit left to rot in a metal bin. Bioluminescent algae clung to the pipes, not glowing precisely, but Tevendy-emitting, a sickly chartreuse light that painted the waterlogged floor in shifting patterns. Each step produced a sound, not a splash, but a wet, drawn-out thquelch, the sound of something yielding, something reluctant. My boots filled with water, a cold, insistent pressure against my skin. It wasn't the ship's ballast water. It felt different, heavier, more viscous. Underwater, on dry land. The sensation was immediate, visceral, a disorientation that threatened to topple me. The cat moved ahead, its tongue a pale, unsettling extrusion, a fleshy pink probe testing the grating ahead. It made a sound, not a meow, but a soft rasp, a scraping against metal as it nudged the key free. It was a small, tarnished thing, the brass dulled with age and neglect. I reached for it, a reflexive gesture, and the familiar coppery bloom returned to my mouth, a phantom ache behind my teeth. Fitopipefa, cutting kuting. That was the sound, a dry, brittle rasp as my fingers closed around the key, a sound wholly incongruous with the damp, submerged environment. The corridor narrowed, the walls pressing in, the chartreuse glow intensifying. I felt a tremor in the deck plating, a subtle vibration that resonated in my bones, a low hum that seemed to emanate from the very structure of the submarine. The cat leaped, a fluid, unsettling motion, and vanished into the keyhole. Its shadow, a dark, elongated silhouette, simply ceased to exist, gone, erased. My own shadow, however, remained. It didn't simply footstay. A second darkness peeled away from my own, mimicking the cat's disappearance, a grotesque duplication that sent a jolt of cold dread through me. It reached, a phantom limb extending towards the keyhole, the darkness rippling, distorting the already warped perspective. The water in my chest swelled, a cold, heavy pressure that constricted my lungs. It wasn't painful, not precisely. It was occupying, filling the space where air should have been. A drowning sensation not of water, but of something heavier, something denser. I tried to draw a breath, but the effort felt strained, labored. The air tasted stale, metallic, like inhaling the dust of forgotten things. My vision blurred, the chartreuse light fracturing into a kaleidoscope of sickly hues. The cat's reflection flickered in the darkness beyond the keyhole. Not a clear reflection, not a true representation. A distortion, a wavering image, like looking through heat haze. Then it blinked. A slow, deliberate blink, an expression that wasn't my own, a flicker of something ancient, something knowing, something utterly alien. It was a violation, a trespass upon my identity. The reflection vanished, dissolving into the blackness, leaving behind only the lingering taste of copper and the crushing weight in my chest. 5 minutes. The cat's agenda. 5 minutes until whatever fate befell that creature, whatever transformation it underwent, would be mirrored in my own flesh. The thought was absurd, ludicrous, yet the waterlogging in my chest intensified. The rhythmic breathing within me grew more pronounced, a damp pulse against my ribs. I watched my own shadow, the duplicated darkness reaching towards the keyhole, a silent, inexorable advance. My limbs felt heavy, unresponsive, as if weighted down by the water in my lungs. I tried to pull back, to resist the unseen force, but my efforts were futile. The shadow's hand closed around the key, turning it with a silent click. The submarine groaned, a deep, resonant sigh that vibrated through the floor, a mechanical lament. A new section of the hull shifted, revealing a narrow passageway, shrouded in darkness. The air grew colder, heavier, saturated with the scent of rust and decay. The breathing inside me intensified, a gurgling rush of air that felt like a prelude to something terrible. I tasted the sweetness again, stronger this time, coating my tongue, filling my throat. The shadows stepped through the opening, disappearing into the darkness, and I knew with a chilling certainty that I was about to follow. I didn't want to. My mind screamed in protest, a frantic, desperate plea for escape. But my body was no longer my own. It moved, propelled by an unseen force, drawn towards the darkness, towards the waiting abyss. I stumbled forward, the water in my lungs swelling, the taste of copper overwhelming. The passageway beckoned, a black maw promising oblivion, and I stepped into it. The brass key was still warm in my palm when the water in my chest decided it had had enough of being temporary. It wasn't a drowning. No, that would imply some dignity, some resistance. This was a slow, bureaucratic invasion, like a tax auditor rifling through your soul's tax forms. My lungs filled with it, not all at once, but in deliberate, measured gulps, as if the thing had a schedule to keep. The first breath was a wetwood hitchy, the sound of a fishing line snagging in the dark. My throat tightened, not from panic, but from the sheer thuddy weight of it, the way it settled into my chest like a second, uninvited organ. I tasted it, coppery thick, the flavor of a coin left too long in a sock drawer. The key slipped from my fingers. It didn't fall. It unfolded. The moment it hit the drain, it wasn't a key anymore. It was a thin strip of brass, a tongue of metal, and when it touched the water pooling there, it twin-sung. Not a sound, not precisely, more like the memory of a sound, a ghost of vibration that set my teeth on edge. The water in the drain didn't ripple, it twin-breathed. A slow, deliberate inhale, then exhale, the surface rising and falling like the chest of something asleep beneath the grates. My blood followed the key down. A slow, reluctant drip at first, then a steady stream, thick and dark, the way ketchup behaves when you're certain it's empty. The first drop hit the water with a sound like a wet kiss. The second made a noise like a thumb being pried from a fist. The third was just silence, the kind that hangs in a room after someone said something unforgivable. I should have been screaming, but my voice had already been filed away, stamped timissing, tucked into the back of some drawer where the light never quite reaches. Instead, I coughed once, twice each expulsion a wet thwitch, the sound of a sponge being wrung out over a bathtub. The machine hummed. Not the idle whir of a submarine at rest, but a rhythmic, insistent, swigh-breathing, syncopated with my own failed attempts at air. It wasn't the ship. It was the soapy water it had learned to mimic. A poor imitation, like a parrot repeating a swear word it doesn't understand. The algae on the walls pulsed in time with it, their chartreuse glow flickering like a faulty neon sign, casting jagged shadows that didn't match my body anymore. My shadow had already moved on. It was leaning over the drain, its fingers its toothy tongue dipping into the blood like a cat testing a saucer, not a reflection this time. A fwilick, a slow, deliberate drag of the brass, strip through the crimson, as if it were savouring the taste of copper, and something older, something that remembered the shape of a key before it was a key. My body wasn't mine anymore, either. That was the worst part. Not the water, not the breathing machine. Not even the way my skin felt like it was being peeled back from the inside out, though that was unpleasant, the way a dentist's drill is unpleasant, or a paper cut, or the moment you realize your favorite sock has gone missing, and you can't remember selling your soul for it. No, the horror was in the separation. My fingers twitched, but they didn't obey. They curled inward, nails digging into the palms of my hands as if trying to claw their way back into place. My ribs expanded, not with breath, but with the pressure of something shifting beneath my skin. Not organs. Not quite. More like the slow, wet unfolding of a map, layer by layer revealing streets I didn't recognize. The machine's breathing grew louder, drowning out the sound of my own failing lungs. It wasn't a machine anymore. It was a foot voice. My voice, or what passed for it. The first tear was the worst. Not the pain, though there was pain. A sharp, thigh-popping sensation like a bubble bursting beneath my sternum. But the way it unzipped, what me? My stomach turned inside out, not all at once, but in stages like a glove being pulled from the hand. The first thing out was a length of intestine, glistening and pink, the texture of a raw steak left too long in the sun. It didn't flop. It twitched, a blind searching thing, as if trying to find something familiar in the air. The algae glowed brighter, their light now a sickly gold, the color of old coins and bad decisions. The cat's reflection. No, not a reflection. A copy. A duplicate pressed into existence like a stamp licked the drain again. Its tongue a pale, fleshy hand skimming the surface of my blood. It wasn't drinking. It was fun tasting. Approval, maybe. Or permission. My skin stitched itself shut. Not with blood, not with scar tissue. No, this was a bureaucratic wound, the kind that vanishes by dawn, filed under Shrithersolved, with a stamp and a sigh. The machine's breathing slowed, synchronized with the rhythmic click-click of a typewriter, the sound of a report being filed, the fizz, closed tweet-eathy. The water in my chest didn't drain, it sea-settled, permanent now, a second lung heavy and unyielding. I could feel it pressing against my ribs, a cold, wet weight, the way a wet towel feels against your skin after a shower you didn't want to take. The cat's reflection. No, the toy cut, because reflections don't lick, don't breathe, don't twatch-watch. Turned its head, not toward me, toward the drain. Toward the sound that wasn't a sound, the silence that was a voice. It spoke. Not in words, never in words, but in the foo shape of them. The way a shadow stretches when the light shifts. The drain didn't gurgle, it tycoed my voice, my real voice. The one I'd lost hours ago, but now returned, warped and wet, like a recording played backward in a bathtub. Ezra, not a question, not a plea, a statement. The water in the drain rose. A slow, deliberate swell, the surface rippling with the sound of my name over and over, until it was all I could hear, all I could feel, the way the air thickens before a storm. The cat's tongue, its tongue hand pressed against the drain's edge. The brass key, now a thin, wet strip, curled around its finger like a wedding ring. It didn't blink, it didn't breathe, it twantuated, and then the machine stopped. Not with a click, not with a sigh, but with the sudden, absolute fifance of sound, the way a light goes out when the bulb burns itself to death. The algae dimmed, their glow fading to a dull, sickly yellow, the color of a bruise that won't heal. The water in my chest didn't move. It didn't breathe. It didn't fifant. Anything. It was just there. A second lung, a second chance, a second life I hadn't asked for. The cat's reflection. No, the cat stepped back. Not away, toward the drain, toward the silence, toward Tuv and me. The drain was empty now, not of blood, but of water, but of twin sound, dude. The shape of my voice, my name, the shape of something that had been said and then unsaid, like a dream you wake up from and immediately forget. The cat's tongue, its horseshoe hand pressed against the drain's edge again. This time it didn't wait, it tonpulled. The water in my chest rose, not in a rush, not in a panic, but in a slow, deliberate climb, like a tide creeping up the shore after a storm. My skin didn't split this time. It stretched, not like skin, like papa. Wet parchment, the kind that gives when you press too hard, the kind that tears if you're not careful. The machine's silence was louder than any sound. It was the sound of a door closing, the sound of a case being filed, the sound of something twin-ending, and then the water reached my throat. And I knew with a terrible sinking certainty that this time it wasn't going to let go. The logbook page was already wet when I found it. Not the kind of damp that comes from a spilled cup of coffee. No, this was the slow, insidious kind, the way a wound weeps before it scabs over, the edges curled like the skin of a dying fish, the ink running in thin, watery lines that bled into the grain of the paper. I didn't need to open it to know what it said. The smell told me everything. Film grain. Asterisk, not the kind you find in a theatre, not the kind that flickers on a screen. This was older, darker. Asterisk, the scent of a reel spinning backward, of celluloid melting in the heat of a projector that hadn't been turned on in decades. I exhaled through my nose, a sound like a deflating balloon, and the page twitched my fingers, not from the wind, not from my breath, from something inside it. Patient 7 had a hand, shaped wound. I didn't write that. Not with a pen, not with my own hand. The words had already been there, pressed into the paper like a brand, the kind of thing you'd find on a cattle ear or the bottom of a shoe. Ezra Thompson, asterisk, not in cursive, not in print. In something twin between, the way a name might look if it were carved by a child with a butter knife, all jagged edges and uneven strokes. I ran my thumb over it, and the paper footweight, not like a razor, not like glass. Like a wet match striking against a strike plate. The kind of sound that makes your teeth ache. The fiber split cleanly, the tear unfolding like a mouth opening. And for a second, I swear I saw something pintween mofed inside it. A shadow, not mine, not the cat. Something older, something that had been waiting. The photo was worse. It wasn't a photo, not really. More like a stain. A negative that had been left too long in the sun. The kind of thing you find in the back of a developer. A cabinet forgotten. Patient 7's face was there, or what passed for a face, a smooth, featureless oval with a single hand-shaped hole punched clean through the center. No blood. No flesh. Just the fundi of sincere of it, like a cookie with a bite taken out. But the cookie was made of twin delight. I pressed my palm to the image, and the paper twin peeled 20 way, not in strips, but in one long, slow unraveling, like a sock coming off a foot. The scar formed where the wound had been. On twine mime, right above my wrist, a thin, pale line that didn't look like skin. It looked like twin film, the kind that catches the light just right, the kind that makes you squint when you're trying to read it. The edges glowed not with blood, but with something quin blue. The same blue as the algae back in the submarine. The same blue as the cat, as tongue when it pressed against the drain. I did scream. Screaming was for people who still believed in consequences. The breathing started again, not in my ears this time, or lean side. My skull. A slow, deliberate inhale, followed by an exhale that wasn't quite mine. The cat's reflection. No, the Thorficat. Because reflections don't point, don't toid, judgewafi, was standing on the desk now, its front paws planted on the logbook like a priest delivering a sermon. Its tongue, that pale, fleshy feet hand, extended toward me, not to touch, to huidicate to the scar, the wound, the swimera. I should have looked away. I should have moved out, but my body had already been filed away, stamped with the resolved, with a date I could. The scar pulsed, not like a heartbeat, like a Futa typewriter key, being pressed over and over, the sound of a report being typed, the sound of a life being documented in real time. Asterisk Ezra Thompson, asterisk not a name, a full label. The cat, tongue, its siphon hand, tapped the paper, and the logbook siphon flipped it on its own, the pages turning like the pages of a book someone else was reading. Patient 7's entry was there, not in ink. In footwater the letters weren't, they were so breathing. The scar on my wrist did the same, a slow rhythmic rise and fall like the surface of the algae in the submarine, like the sulfy water in my chest when it decided to settle in for good. The copper taste was back, not in my mouth, in my fush, and a metallic drip The kind of thing you'd feel if you were lying in a dentist. His chair and the anesthesia had worn off just enough to remind you that your body was still Torva. The cat's tongue pressed against the scar, and the wound unzipped again, but this time it wasn't teeth or paper tearing. It was Kundin. My skin split open, not in a line but in a full shape. The same shape as the hand, shaped wound in the photo, the same shape as the cat, as tongue when it reached for me. The flesh didn't bleed, it twin-peeled back, like the skin of a banana, but the inside wasn't tea yellow, it was footy gold. Not the gold of coins, not the gold of a wedding ring, the gold of 20th, Verl, Windhaith. The yellowed teeth, the kind that had been left in a drawer for too long, the kind that remembered the taste of something long dead, the cat its reflection. No, the cat licked the wound. Not with its tongue, with its seventh hand. A slow, deliberate drag, like a butcher testing the sharpness of a knife. The scar stitched itself shut, not with blood, not with stitches, with trifapa. Wet parchment, the kind that gives when you press too hard, the kind that tears if you're not careful. The logbook soon slammed shut, the sound like a gunshot in a library, and the breathing stopped. Not all at once, but in stages. Like a machine powering down, like a full-life being filed away, the scar was still there, but it wasn't T-mine anymore. It was City's team. The cat stung, its swift hand pulled back, and the wound glowed, not blue this time. Font gold, asterisk the same gold as the teeth, the same gold as the algae in the submarine, the same gold as the footy water in my chest when it to stay. The logbook was empty now, not blank, empty. Asterisk like a drawer with nothing in it, like a fuffa case, with no file, the cat's reflection. No, the fuffa cut turned its head, not toward me, toward the scar, toward the formula. It spoke, not in words, never in words, but in the full shape of them. The scar, full start, and the paper cut again, the sound like a typewriter key being pressed, over and over, the sound of a name being typed, the sound of a thush life being documented in real time. Asterisk Ezra Thompson, asterisk not a question, not a plea. Asterisk the cat's tongue, its ton hand pressed against the wound, and the scarred wimble dwee, not blue this time. Cold asterisk. The city exhaled a sickly green, a luminescence that didn't illuminate so much as 20 coated dead everything in a film of decay. It wasn't rain, not exactly, more like the sky weeping oil slicking the pavement and turning the refuse into a shifting mosaic. I stumbled, my boots sinking into a layer of something that felt like shredded paper and wet fur. The brass key, cool against my palm just moments before, slipped from my grasp but didn't clatter. It tayshank, not into the grime but tuven through it as if the street had opened up to receive it. A sharp sting bloomed on my ankle, a familiar sensation. I glanced down. A thin, crimson line, still welling, traced the shape of a hand, not a cut, not precisely. More like the paper itself had decided to adhere to my skin, then sheared away, leaving behind a raised, burning track. It tasted of nothing, but the air around it buzzed with a faint metallic tang, a phantom echo of copper. The cat's reflection. No, the 20 cat, because reflections don't hold themselves with that rigid stillness, was fixed on the spot where the key vanished. It wasn't looking to die the puddle, it was looking through it. It had something on the other side. Its gaze, unnervingly focused, tracked my every move. The pale hand of a tongue flicked out, not to lap at the oily water, but to point a precise, deliberate gesture toward my wounded ankle. I waded deeper into the sprawl, the debris crunching underfoot. Discarded data chips, shattered screens, the skeletal remains of what might have once been toys. Each piece felt wrong, not broken, but one wound. Like someone had taken the threads of their existence and pulled, unraveling them until nothing remained but fragmented echoes. The rhythmic pulse in my ears intensified, a slow, deliberate beat that seemed to synchronize with the flickering neon signs. It wasn't a sound I heard with my ears, but a vibration in my teeth, a tremor in my bones. The creature coalesced from the refuse, not as a single entity, but as an accumulation. A shifting mass of discarded memories, tangled wires, and decaying plastic. It didn't move with purpose, but with the inertia of everything forgotten, a slow, deliberate rising like a tide of trash. The smell wasn't offensive, not in the way you'd expect. It was nostalgic. A cloying sweetness mingled with the acrid tang of ozone and something else. Something ancient, something that had been buried for a long time. I drew my scalpel, the steel cold and familiar in my grip. It felt absurd, wielding a surgical instrument against a mountain of garbage, but it was all I had. I lunged, slicing through the shifting mass. The blade met no resistance, but the creature didn't react as I expected. It didn't bleed, didn't scream. It simply absorbed the cut, the edges of the wound knitting themselves closed with a sickening, wet sound. The trash began to compact, to form, not into a coherent shape, but into a mockery of one. A distorted parody of a human figure, its limbs twisted and broken, its head a jumbled mess of screens and wires. The breathing grew louder, closer. Not in my ears, but deep inside, my chest. A suffocating pressure, as if my lungs were filling with something thick and viscous. I slashed again, and again, the scalpel a silver blur against the darkness. Each cut seemed to accelerate the creature's transformation, forcing it into a more recognizable and therefore more horrifying form. It was becoming me, not a perfect replica, but a grotesque imitation. A funhouse mirror version of my own body, cobbled together from the detritus of forgotten lives. Then I saw it, in the slick, oily surface of a particularly large puddle. The cat's reflection shifted. It wasn't mirroring my movements anymore. It was mirroring the creature. The pale hand of its tongue extended, not toward me, but toward the distorted reflection of my own form. A slow, deliberate drag across the surface of the water, and in that reflection the hand wasn't pale. It was pooty gold. The puddle rippled, and the scar on my ankle twin glowed, not with the dull crimson of blood, but with a radiant, metallic sheen. The water around my feet began to churn, to breathe. A slow, rhythmic rise and fall like the surface of a lung. The creature's form solidified. Its eyes, two flickering screens, locking onto mine. It didn't speak, but a voice echoed in my skull. Not a voice I recognized, not a voice I'd ever heard before, a voice that felt familiar. Ezra Thompson. The cat's reflection. No, the thoricut turned its head, not toward me, toward the creature, toward the Twitcher hall that had opened up in the street, a gaping maw of darkness, lined with teeth. The creature reached for me, its golden hand outstretched. The cat's tongue pressed against the glowing scar, and the world dissolved into a wash of green and gold. The water surged, engulfing my feet, my legs, my chest. I didn't struggle. I didn't scream. I simply let it take me. The last thing I saw, before the darkness closed in, was the cat's reflection, smiling. I waded through the trash, each step an effort against the resistance of memories compressed into decaying matter. It felt like walking on shattered glass wrapped in wet velvet, every shift sending shards of reminiscence stabbing into my boots. The creature before me wasn't alive. Not exactly. But it was breathing, rhythmic like a metronome counting down to some inevitable crescendo. It reached out, long fingers tipped with bone, white nails that clicked against the paper skin of an old newspaper as if playing a melody only it could hear. Shredding, like dry bones breaking under pressure, echoed through the neon-drenched slum. I watched, detached and clinical, as letters floated free from their moorings, words liberated from context. The breathing grew louder, closer. It was in my ear now, a wet rasp that felt too intimate for comfort. A chill ran down my spine, not unlike the sensation of cold metal pressing against flesh just before it cuts deep. I drew my scalpel, the steel cool and familiar as an old lover's touch. I slashed at the creature, but there was no resistance. It was like cutting through smoke, each stroke dissipating into nothingness until only the sound remained. Thiffy paper, cutting, dry and precise, echoing in this wet graveyard of forgotten lives. The rhythm intensified, syncopated now with my heartbeat, pounding in my chest like a warning drum. The creature began to coagulate around me, memories clotting together like blood in water. It formed a pattern on the ground, a keyhole, vast and yawning, lined with teeth that seemed to bite at nothingness itself. We mirrored. I thought detachedly, remembering how light plays tricks when reflected too many times. I reached out, my hand trembling slightly despite myself. The air around the keyhole shimmered like heat haze over asphalt on a summer's day. My fingers dipped into it, felt something wet and cold grasp them, a tongue, a mouth, and pull me deeper. My hand was suddenly waterlogged, heavy with liquid that shouldn't be there but was nonetheless present. I struggled against the sensation of drowning without being underwater, my heart pounding wildly now as panic threatened to drown out rational thought. The cat's reflection in a nearby puddle shifted. It wasn't mirroring me anymore, it was mimicking something else. Its pale hand, tongue had extended, not toward me, but toward the creature's keyhole reflection. A slow drag across the surface of the water, leaving behind golden trails that glowed briefly before fading away. Then pain bloomed in my palm like a sudden flower, sharp and unexpected. I looked down to see blood welling from a deep cut where there had been none moments ago. 5 minutes' hiss whispered something inside me. The cat's lick, the creature's breath, the keyhole's pull, they were all connected by some unseen thread that stretched back 5 minutes into my past. I felt it again then. That overwhelming sense of dread mixed with absurd humor at this bureaucratic nightmare where I was both protagonist and punchline. No exit echoed through me like a refrain from an old song I couldn't quite remember the lyrics to. The cat's reflection smiled, its mouth opening wide enough for shadows to spill out. Behind it, the keyhole pulsed rhythmically, inhaling darkness with every breath it stole from my lungs. And as it pulled harder at my hand, squeezed defaki paper, cutting TV late that I was already part of this loop. My reflection in another puddle caught my eye. It wasn't moving quite right either. Its mouth opened and closed soundlessly, mimicking the creature's breath instead of mine. 5 minutes later, it would be me who couldn't scream, whose voice had been stolen by something old and hungry lurking just beyond sight. But there was nothing behind me now, not even myself reflected back at me. Just endless darkness stretching out like a welcoming maw ready to swallow whole whatever foolish enough to step inside. He pressed his voice into the keyhole, a desperate, futile gesture. It wasn't a plea, not anymore. It was a test, a morbid curiosity to see if any sound would emerge from the yawning darkness. Silence said, absolute suffocating silence. Then a tearing. Not the clean break of metal, but a wet, reluctant split, like ancient parchment unwilling to yield. Wet paper, The sound clung to the air, thick and oily, coating my tongue with a residue of something indefinable, a memory perhaps, or the phantom taste of regret. My breath hitched, a strangled gasp swallowed by the oppressive stillness. I dropped the brass key. It clattered against the grimy floor of the submarine, the sound oddly loud in the vacuum of quiet. Then, a new sound began to build, tearing, escalating, layered over the initial crack. A forky purpur, cutting, a precise surgical rasp as if 1,000 documents were being shredded simultaneously, each one containing a fragment of a life I no longer recognized. It resonated deep within my bones, a vibration that seemed to unravel my very structure. The cat's reflection in the condensation on a nearby viewport, the screamed, not a vocalization, but a distortion of the image, a violent shudder that rippled across its feline features. Its eyes widened, pupils dilating until they consumed the irises, black pools reflecting an abyss I dared not contemplate. The scream wasn't sound, it was a visual assault, a fracturing of reality that sent a jolt of icy terror through my limbs. The scream wasn't its own. It was a desperate echo of something else, something trapped within the keyhole. The 5 minutes, the time signature pulsed in my skull, a relentless metronome, counting down to an unknown catastrophe. A memory surfaced sharp and unwelcome. The feel of sterile gloves, the cold weight of a scalpel in my hand, the blank, expectant faces of patients I could no longer recall. I tasted copper, a faint, metallic tang on my tongue that had nothing to do with blood. It was the taste of the key, the taste of the submarine, the taste of the inevitable. My hand, still outstretched towards the keyhole, began to throb. A sharp, localized pain blossomed in my palm, radiating outwards like a noxious bloom. I looked down to see a crimson line tracing its way across my skin, a deep, clean cut where moments before there had been nothing. It wasn't a graze, it was a deliberate incision, precise and unnervingly clean. Waterlogging began in my lungs, a suffocating weight that pressed down on my chest, stealing my breath. It wasn't the sensation of drowning, it was something far more insidious. The feeling of being submerged in a viscous, unseen fluid, my lungs filling with a substance that defied definition. The reflection in the viewport detached itself. It didn't mirror my movements anymore. It stepped out of the warped, distorted surface, solidifying into a separate entity. Its eyes were black, bottomless pits devoid of any discernible light. They weren't the eyes of a cat. They were the eyes of something ancient, something hungry. They desired my life, not in a predatory way, not exactly. It was a yearning, a desperate need to replace, to subsume. The system. It was all part of the system. A vast, bureaucratic labyrinth of rules and regulations, protocols and procedures. A system with no exit, no appeal. No recourse! The no exit! The phrase echoed in my mind, a mantra of despair. I felt the weight of it, the crushing certainty that I was trapped, a pawn in a game I didn't understand, played by forces I couldn't comprehend. The reflection smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile. It was a predatory curve of the lips, a silent promise of oblivion. The 5 minutes before my own smile, the realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I was becoming it. I was becoming the thing that desired my life. The thing that haunted the keyhole. The thing that controlled the system. My voice caught in my throat. I tried to speak, to scream, but only a strangled gurgle escaped my lips. The waterlogging intensified, constricting my airways, stealing the air from my lungs. The 4D paper-cutting sound returned, louder now, closer, as if the keyhole itself was drawing nearer. It was inside me, inside my throat, inside my head. It was consuming me. I ran. Not with purpose, but with the panicked energy of a thing flushed from its burrow. The submarine's narrow corridors offered little in the way of escape, just a claustrophobic maze of cold, curved steel. Each impact of my boots against the metal floor sent a tremor through the vessel. A hollow reverberation that seemed to mock my efforts. I reached the viewport, the thick acrylic warped and clouded with decades of accumulated grime and the bioluminescent bloom of deep-sea organisms. They pulsed with a sickly, internal light, casting dancing shadows that writhed across the control panels. The rhythmic thrumming, a slow, deliberate cadence, intensified. It wasn't mechanical. It resonated within my own chest, mirroring the frantic beat of my heart. It was breathing. Someone, or something, was breathing directly behind me, the exhalation ghosting across the back of my neck. A cold slickness spread across my throat, not from moisture, but from a phantom touch. The cat, or what remained of it, was close, a rough rusk against my skin. I flinched, turning slightly. The creature's tongue, a pale, disturbingly human hand, traced a line down my neck, lingering on the raw, weeping cut. It wasn't a wound inflicted by a blade, but a deliberate parting, as if my flesh had simply yielded. The sensation was less pain, more a profound sense of quinwrongness. The cat didn't consume. It burrowed. It tasted not blood, but the architecture of my being, the mirror. It had mirrored me for a time. Now, the reflection was a separate entity, a fractured echo of my own form. The waterlogging, that insidious internal flood, had worsened. My lungs burned, not with the sting of salt water, but with the weight of something viscous and alien. Each breath was a struggle. A desperate attempt to draw air into organs that were slowly, irrevocably filling with something that wasn't air. I tried to scream, to release the mounting terror, but only a strangled gurgle escaped my lips. The sound was swallowed by the submarine, absorbed by the damp metal and the pulsing bioluminescence. Instead, a new sound emerged, a delicate, insistent rasp for paper. It wasn't an external noise, but a vibration within my skull, as if 1,000 documents were being shredded inside my brain, each fragment containing a piece of my identity. The sound grew, escalating into a frenzied chorus of tearing, a relentless assault on my sanity. My reflection moved. It wasn't a synchronized movement, a simple mirroring of my actions. It was a deliberate, independent gesture. A hand, pale and elongated, reached out from the warped surface of the viewport, fingers flexing, nails like brittle bone. It grasped my shoulder. The grip surprisingly strong and twin-poled did the eyes of a cat anymore. They were black, bottomless voids, devoid of any light, any warmth, any recognition. They weren't merely looking for it at me. They were looking for through me, assessing, evaluating, for desiring, not my life, not in the conventional sense. It was a need to replace, to subsume, to become the vessel for something ancient and hungry. 5 minutes. The time signature, a relentless metronome, pulsed in my skull. 5 minutes until my own smile mirrored the predatory curve of the reflection's lips. 5 minutes until I became the thing that haunted the keyhole, the thing that controlled the system. My shadow flickered, distorted, then twin split. A second darker silhouette peeled away from my form, writhing on the metal floor like a discarded skin. It wasn't a shadow cast by light, but a manifestation of something internal, a bureaucratic wound that had festered and broken free. A permanent severance. The submarine groaned, a deep resonant shudder that ran through the entire structure. Cracks spiderwebbed across the viewport, glowing with the eerie light of the bioluminescent organisms. The metal buckled, strained, and then, with a deafening screech, 2 feet hooked, a cracked open. Not to the ocean, not to the crushing pressure of the abyssal depths, but to something else, a void, a space that defied geometry, a swirling vortex of darkness and decay. The sensation of being underwater intensified. But there was no water. It was a feeling of complete immersion, of being submerged in a viscous, unseen fluid that permeated every cell of my body. No exit. The phrase echoed in my mind, a mantra of despair. I was trapped. A pawn in a game I didn't understand. played by forces I couldn't comprehend. The reflection's hand tightened on my shoulder, pulling me inexorably towards the fractured viewport, towards the gaping maw of the void. The sensation of falling, of being drawn into an abyss, overwhelmed me. The cat's tongue, still tracing the line of my throat, tasted like dust and regret. And then darkness. I turned. The reflection smiled. Not the hollow mimicry of the viewport's warped surface, but a deliberate predatory curve of lips that didn't match my own frozen panic. It was Sumirid. The waterlogging began in my chest, a slow, viscous seep, cold and thick as oil. Not the sting of salt water, but the weight of something ancient and wrong. My lungs burned, not with air deprivation, but with the deliberate filling of a fluid that felt like wet parchment tearing inside me. I tried to inhale, to push back the tide. But only a faint gurgle escaped, swallowed by the submarine's damp metal ribs and the bioluminescent bloom clinging to the walls like decaying lace. The reflection's hand, pale and elongated, reached further from the glass, fingers brushing my shoulder, not touching but tushing, pressing, leaving a trail of cold that felt like the touch of a forgotten file. A wee body turning inside out. It wasn't a metaphor. I felt it, the internal rearrangement, the slow unspooling of my own structure, as if my bones were being refiled into a different drawer. My skin prickled with the sensation of being peeled back, not to reveal blood, but to show the intricate, bureaucratic stitching of my own flesh. The reflection's eyes, those bottomless voids, held mine. They weren't judging, they were 2D assessing, cataloguing the inefficiencies of my current vessel. 5 minutes, the metronome in my skull pulsed, a relentless tick against the silence. 5 minutes, until my own smile mirrored that predatory curve. 5 minutes is until I became the thing that haunted the keyhole, the thing that controlled the system. The reflection's hand tightened, pulling me forward. I stumbled, my boots scraping the cold metal floor with a sound like dry leaves. The submarine groaned, a deep, resonant shudder that vibrated up through my soles. Cracks spider-webbed across the viewport, glowing with the sickly green light of the bioluminescent organisms. The metal buckled, strained, and then crack. Not a shattering, but a slow, deliberate parting, like a document being torn in half. The opening wasn't to the crushing blackness of the ocean, but to something else. A void, a swirling vortex of darkness and decay, smelling faintly of ozone and wet paper. The sensation of being underwater intensified, but there was no water. It was a feeling of complete immersion, of being submerged in a viscous, unseen fluid that permeated every cell, thick as old glue. I fell, not down, but into the void pulled by the reflection's grip. My shadow flickered, distorted, then furted. A second, darker silhouette peeled away from my form, writhing on the metal floor like a discarded skin. It wasn't a shadow cast by light, but a manifestation of something internal, a bureaucratic wound that had festered and broken free. The reflection's grip on my shoulder was iron. I felt the key roll into my palm, cold brass tasting faintly of copper and rust. Familiared. The reflection's lips moved silently, the whisper cutting through the rising twin paper, cutting in my skull, the sound of documents shredding inside my brain. The key felt alien, its edges sharp against my skin, a physical anchor to the horror. Funyor the lock. The whisper wasn't in the air. It was in the marrow of my bones, in the footy paper cutting, tearing at my sanity. 5 minutes is. My reflection's eyes, now impossibly wide and black, held mine with absolute certainty. The waterlogging spread upward, a cold tide rising in my throat, filling my mouth with the taste of wet parchment and regret. I tried to scream, to break the silence, but only a wet, gurgling sound emerged, the sound of foody water filling lungs, slow, inevitable, the sound of a file being sealed shut. The reflection's smile widened, impossibly wide, stretching the skin of its face like a document being folded. Its eyes, those bottomless voids, held mine, no longer watching through me, but into me seeing the empty file drawer where my life should be. No, Exeter. The phrase echoed, not in my mind, but in the very structure of the submarine, in the groaning metal, in the sooty paper, cutting chorus inside my skull, the rhythmic breathing behind my ear, the sound of breathing faded. The silence wasn't empty. It was the silence of a closed file, of a system with no more entries. The reflection's hand tightened, pulling me closer to the fracture, to the void. I felt the cold, viscous fluid rising in my chest, filling my lungs, pressing against the walls of my throat. The reflection's smile was my own, but wrong, mirrored. The key, cold in my palm, tasted like copper and the end of everything. My vision blurred, the bioluminescent glow from the viewport bleeding into the void. The last thing I registered was the reflection's eyes black, bottomless, too desiring as my own eyes filled with water.